I'll give you $10,000 if you can answer one question, Daniel Carter said without looking up from his phone, his voice smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that had closed billion-dollar deals in rooms far quieter than this one, and yet somehow louder in authority, heavier in expectation, the weight of it settling across the white tablecloth like another piece of silverware. The men around him chuckled softly, not because the joke was particularly funny, but because laughter was the currency of proximity to power, and Daniel Carter was a man people invested in, even socially. Across from them, standing still with a small notepad in her hand, Emily Brooks didn't laugh, didn't shift her weight, didn't perform the polite smile most servers perfected within their first week. She simply stood there, calm, present, as if the moment wasn't designed to measure her worth. The restaurant glowed in warm amber light, crystal glasses catching reflections of movement, quiet conversations folding into one another, the soft hum of wealth being spent without hesitation. And yet in the middle of it all, there was a pause, subtle but real, the kind that happens when something doesn't go according to expectation. Daniel finally looked up, just briefly, just enough to register her stillness, her lack of reaction, and something in his expression flickered, curiosity or irritation. It was hard to tell. "Keep it," Emily said gently, her voice steady, almost too calm for the situation. "Ask anyway." And that was the first shift, small but undeniable, because people didn't usually decline money from Daniel Carter, not even symbolically, not even in jest. One of the men raised an eyebrow, another leaned back slightly, watching now instead of participating, sensing that the dynamic had changed, even if they couldn't yet explain how. Daniel set his phone down, slowly this time, his attention no longer divided, because control, to him, wasn't just about wealth, it was about reading people, predicting them, placing them into categories that made them manageable, and this woman, this waitress, wasn't fitting neatly into any of them. "All right," he said, leaning forward just enough to signal engagement. "Where would you invest $1 million today?" The question hung in the air, deceptively simple, engineered with precision, because most people, when faced with it, would either hesitate or overreach, revealing more about their ignorance than their knowledge. And that was the point, the quiet test beneath the humor. Emily didn't answer right away, and that pause, brief as it was, stretched the moment just enough to draw attention, her eyes meeting his, not challenging, not submissive, just steady, as if she were evaluating him in return. And for a fraction of a second, Daniel felt something unfamiliar, not discomfort exactly, but the absence of control he was used to holding. She glanced at the table, the untouched water, the perfectly aligned silverware, the watch on his wrist that probably cost more than her yearly rent, and then back at him, as if connecting details no one else thought mattered. "That depends," she said finally, her tone unchanged, "on whether you're asking for growth, protection, or correction." And the table went quiet, not dramatically, not abruptly, but in that gradual way conversations fade when something more interesting takes over. Daniel's fingers paused against the edge of his glass, just for a moment, because that wasn't the kind of answer he expected, not from her, not here, and certainly not without hesitation. He leaned back slightly, studying her now, really studying her, the way he would analyze a pitch deck or a negotiation tactic, looking for the flaw, the gap, the place where confidence outran competence, but all he found was stillness, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. Emily continued, not faster, not slower, just precise. Because those are three different strategies, and most people confuse them. And somewhere in the room, a glass clinked softly, a server passed by, life continued as usual. But at this table, something had shifted, something subtle but irreversible. Because for the first time that evening, Daniel Carter wasn't being entertained, he was being answered, and he hadn't decided yet if that was a position he was comfortable being in. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that alone shifted the balance again because men like him always had something to say, always had a counterpoint ready. But this time he simply studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if recalculating a model that no longer behaved the way it should. "Correction," he repeated slowly, the word unfamiliar in this context, not because he did not understand it, but because it was rarely applied to him. "Explain that." And his tone was no longer amused, it was focused. Controlled, the humor stripped away like a layer that had served its purpose. Emily did not move, not even to adjust her posture, her hands still lightly holding the notepad, her presence quiet but unshaken. Correction is when the strategy is not about growth or safety, she said, her voice even. It is about fixing what should not have been there in the first place. And she paused just long enough for the words to settle, not forcing them, not emphasizing them, just letting them exist. One of the men at the table shifted in his seat. Another glanced at Daniel briefly, sensing the direction of the conversation but unsure whether to intervene. Because this was no longer entertainment, it was something closer to exposure. Daniel leaned forward again, slower this time, his fingers interlocking as they rested on the table, a subtle sign of engagement that most people would have missed. But Emily did not look away. "So you are saying most people are wrong?" he asked, not aggressively, but with a precision that suggested he was testing her limits now, not her knowledge. "No," Emily replied softly. "I am saying most people answer the question they want to be asked, not the one that actually matters." And there it was again, that slight shift, that quiet repositioning of control, because she was no longer reacting to him. She was guiding the direction without raising her voice. Daniel's gaze held hers a moment longer, and then something in his expression changed, not visibly to everyone else, but enough, a small tightening around the eyes, the kind that appears when someone hears something uncomfortably accurate. "And what would you choose?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful, as if the question had moved from performance to intention. Emily glanced at the table again, at the untouched glass, at the reflection of the overhead light bending slightly through the crystal, and then back to him. "That depends on whether the $1 million is clean," she said, and the word hung there, not in a moral sense, but in a structural one, precise, deliberate. One of the men let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but stopped halfway, uncertain if it was appropriate. Because the tone had shifted beyond casual boundaries, Daniel did not react immediately, and that pause, longer this time, carried weight, because she had not just answered his question, she had reframed it entirely. "Everything I have is accounted for," he said finally, his voice steady. But there was something underneath it now, something less certain, not doubt, but awareness. Emily nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "Then I would ask why you are still holding positions that no longer align with your own reports," she said, and this time, the silence that followed was different, not ambient, not casual, but intentional, the kind that presses against the edges of a room and makes people suddenly aware of where they are sitting. Daniel's fingers stilled completely, his posture unchanged but no longer relaxed, because that was not a general observation, that was specific, precise in a way that suggested access, understanding, or both. He did not speak. Right away, and no one else at the table dared to fill the space. Because for the first time that evening, the question was not directed at her. It was directed at him, and the answer was not as easy as it had been a few minutes ago. No one at the table moved, not even slightly, and the air seemed to hold its shape around the words she had just spoken, as if the room itself was waiting to see what Daniel Carter would do next. His gaze remained fixed on Emily, but it was no longer the casual observation of a man assessing a stranger. It was sharper now, more deliberate. The kind of focus he reserved for situations that did not behave according to expectation. "That is a very specific assumption," he said. Finally, his voice calm, controlled, but stripped of the earlier playfulness, and somewhere in the background a server passed by with a tray of glasses, the soft clink of crystal briefly breaking the silence before fading again into the edges of the room. Emily did not react to the shift in tone, did not soften or retreat. She simply held her position, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral but not distant. "It is not an assumption," she replied quietly. "It is a pattern," and the distinction landed heavier than the words themselves. Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, not in frustration, but in recognition of something he could not immediately dismiss. And that alone was unusual, because dismissal had always been his first defense, the easiest way to maintain control. One of the men at the table cleared his throat, as if considering stepping in, but thought better of it, sensing that this was no longer a conversation meant for interruption. "What pattern?" Daniel asked, his voice lower now, more measured, not challenging for the sake of dominance, but searching, and that subtle shift did not go unnoticed. Emily glanced down briefly, not in hesitation, but as if organizing the information she was about to present, and when she looked back up, her eyes were steady, almost analytical. The kind where confidence replaces verification, she said. Where success becomes a reason to stop questioning your own numbers. And she paused just long enough for the implication to register without forcing it. Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table, a small movement, almost unconscious, but telling, because it was the first sign of disruption in his otherwise controlled demeanor. You are speaking very confidently about something you should not have access to, he said, and this time there was a hint of steel in his voice, not aggression, but boundary, the kind that separates public information from private strategy. Emily did not flinch, did not step back. Public filings are not private, she said simply, and most people do not read past the summary. And again, the table fell into that quiet, attentive stillness that had replaced the earlier laughter. Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough to signal that something had shifted internally, because she was not guessing, she was referencing, and that meant she had done more than observe, she had studied. Line 47, she added, her tone unchanged, almost as if she were recalling something routine, the allocation that does not match the stated risk profile. And this time, there was no mistaking it. The reaction was immediate, subtle but real, a pause in his breathing, a fraction of a second where his expression lost its composure before returning to its usual control. No one else at the table spoke, but the weight of the moment was undeniable now, because this was no longer about a clever answer or an unexpected response. This was about precision, about accuracy that could not be easily dismissed as coincidence. Daniel leaned forward again, slower than before, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in focus. The kind that precedes a decision rather than a reaction. "Who are you?" he asked, and the question was no longer rhetorical, no longer casual. It carried intent now. Genuine curiosity layered with something deeper, something closer to respect, even if he had not fully acknowledged it yet. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, then gently set the notepad down on the edge of the table, her movements unhurried, unbothered by the attention. "Someone who reads," she said softly, and there was no arrogance in her voice, no attempt to elevate herself, just a simple statement that somehow carried more weight than any title could have. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with realization, because for the first time that evening, Daniel Carter was no longer the one defining the conversation, and he knew it. Daniel did not look away, and that in itself said more than any response he could have given, because men in his position were not accustomed to holding silence unless they had already calculated the outcome. But this time there was no immediate conclusion, no quick categorization to place her into. His eyes moved slightly, not scanning the room, but returning to her with a different kind of attention, one that measured not just what she said, but how she carried it, the absence of hesitation, the absence of need. "People read," he said slowly, almost as if testing the weight of her words, "but they do not usually interpret correctly." And his tone was no longer dismissive. It was probing, searching for the edge where confidence turns into overreach. Emily tilted her head just slightly, not as a reaction, but as if acknowledging the statement as part of a larger conversation rather than a challenge. "That is true," she replied. "But interpretation is easier when you are not trying to protect a position." And the sentence landed with quiet precision, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore. One of the men at the table shifted again, his glass stopping halfway to his lips, because the conversation had moved beyond anything that resembled casual dinner talk. And now it felt like something else entirely, something closer to a boardroom. Except the roles were no longer clear. Daniel exhaled softly, his hand moving to adjust his cuff, a subtle gesture, controlled, but unnecessary, the kind people make when buying time, when recalibrating. "And you believe I am protecting something," he said, his voice steady, but with a slight narrowing at the end, not quite a question, not quite a statement. Emily did not answer immediately, and that pause carried weight again. Not hesitation, but choice. the deliberate pacing of someone who understood timing better than most. "I believe everyone protects something," she said finally, her voice even. "The difference is whether they know it." And this time, the silence that followed was not just attentive, it was reflective, because the words were no longer directed at him alone. They echoed outward, touching something broader. Daniel leaned back again, slower now, his gaze drifting for just a second toward the center of the table, the untouched plates, the carefully arranged setting that suddenly felt irrelevant, and then back to her. "You are not just a waitress," he said. And it was not a question, not even an accusation. It was a conclusion, quiet but firm. Emily's expression did not change, not even slightly. "I serve tables," she replied, and there was something in the simplicity of that answer that made it harder to challenge than any explanation could have. Daniel studied her again, longer this time, as if trying to locate the missing piece, the background that would make her fit into a structure he understood, but nothing presented itself, no visible markers, no obvious indicators, just composure, just clarity. "Where did you learn to read financial reports like that?" he asked, and now the curiosity was unmistakable, stripped of ego, stripped of performance, just direct. Emily glanced briefly toward the edge of the room, where another table signaled quietly for service, and then back at him, her priorities still intact despite the shift in attention. "The same place everyone can," she said. "I just did not stop at the first page." And the answer, simple as it was, carried a quiet finality, as if closing a door without making a sound. Daniel's lips pressed together slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition, because the truth in her words was not complex. It was just inconvenient, and inconvenience, he knew, was often the beginning of something he could not ignore. The room around them resumed its motion, conversations picking up, glasses being refilled, but at their table, the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be reversed. Because whatever this had started as, a joke, a test, a moment of casual control, it had become something else entirely, something that Daniel Carter could not simply dismiss, and for the first time that evening, he did not try. Daniel's gaze lingered a second longer than necessary, then shifted, not away from her entirely, but enough to signal a transition, a man deciding his next move carefully instead of reacting on instinct. And that alone marked a change, because instinct had always been enough for him before. He reached for his glass, lifting it slightly, but not drinking, the motion more habit than need. "You are careful with your answers," he said, his voice quieter now, measured, not challenging, just observing. And there was a subtle respect forming beneath the surface, not yet spoken, but present. Emily did not respond immediately, her attention briefly moving to the table beside them where a couple waited patiently, their menus still closed, their expectations simple and grounded in something entirely different from this exchange. And for a moment, she stepped away, just 2 steps, just long enough to refill a glass, to adjust a plate, to do the job she had claimed without hesitation, and then she returned, the rhythm of her movement unchanged, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Daniel watched that too, the ease with which she shifted between roles without losing composure, without carrying the weight of the conversation into the next task, and it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately define. "Most people talk too much when they want to prove something," he continued when she was back at the table, his tone thoughtful now, almost reflective. "You do the opposite." And this time it was not a test. It was an acknowledgement, quiet but real. Emily placed the water pitcher down gently, aligning it with the edge of the table without looking, a small, precise motion that spoke of habit, of control and details most overlooked. "Talking is easy," she said, her voice soft. "Understanding is quieter." And the words settled between them with a calm certainty that did not ask for agreement. One of the men at the table leaned forward slightly, curiosity overcoming hesitation. "If you understand so much," he said carefully, not confrontational, but intrigued, "why are you here?" And it was the question everyone had been holding, not out of judgment, but out of genuine confusion, because the pieces did not align in the way they expected. Emily glanced at him briefly, then back to Daniel, not dismissing the question, but choosing where to place her answer. "Because being here does not prevent understanding," she replied. and there was no defensiveness in her tone. No attempt to justify. Just a simple truth delivered without weight. Daniel's fingers tapped once more against the table, slower this time, deliberate, as if marking a point in his own thoughts. You could be somewhere else, he said, and this time it was not a statement about her job. It was about potential, about placement, about the invisible hierarchy he had spent his life navigating. Emily met his gaze again, steady as before. So could most people, she said, and the simplicity of it shifted the meaning entirely, because it removed exception and replaced it with perspective. The table fell quiet again, not uncomfortably, but thoughtfully, each person absorbing the exchange in their own way. And Daniel leaned back once more, his posture relaxed but his expression focused. The earlier certainty replaced by something more complex, something that required time rather than immediate resolution. He studied her for a moment longer, then reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a card, placing it on the table with a controlled motion, not sliding it toward her yet, just setting it there. If you ever decide you do not want to serve tables, he said, his voice calm, no longer carrying the edge of command, call me. And for the first time that evening, the offer did not feel like a test. It felt like recognition, understated but genuine. Emily looked at the card, then at him, her expression unchanged, unreadable but not closed, and she did not reach for it immediately, did not rush to accept or decline. She simply let it sit there, between them, like everything else that had been said, waiting to be understood before being acted upon. Emily did not reach for the card, not immediately, and that pause stretched just long enough to change the meaning of the moment, because most people would have taken it without thinking, would have seen it as opportunity, as validation, as a door opening. But she simply let it remain where it was, resting quietly against the white tablecloth as if it carried no urgency at all. Daniel noticed that, of course he did, because he noticed everything that did not follow the expected pattern, and his eyes remained on her, not impatient, not insistent, just observing, waiting, as if this, too, was part of something he needed to understand. You are not curious? He asked after a moment, his tone calm, but carrying a hint of something new, not challenge, not ego, something closer to genuine interest. Emily glanced at the card again, then back at him, her expression steady, unchanged. I am, she said softly, just not in a hurry. And the simplicity of that answer settled over the table in a way that made the earlier conversation feel almost loud by comparison. One of the men let out a quiet breath, leaning back as if releasing tension he had not realized he was holding, because the exchange had moved beyond anything he could predict. And now it was no longer about who was right. It was about how differently two people could approach the same moment. Daniel nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging something internal rather than external, and for a brief second, his gaze shifted to the card himself, as if seeing it from her perspective, not as an offer, but as an option, one among many, not a defining moment, just a possibility. Most people would have taken it already, he said, not as criticism, but as observation, his voice even, reflective. Emily adjusted the edge of a folded napkin beside one of the plates, aligning it with quiet precision before answering. Most people decide based on what is offered, she said, not on whether they need it. And again, the words did not demand agreement. They simply existed, clear and grounded. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table now, the distance between them smaller, not physically significant, but symbolically different, because the conversation had moved closer to something real, something unguarded. And you do not need it, he said, watching her carefully, not assuming, but testing the space between assumption and truth. Emily met his gaze, unflinching. I need different things, she replied, and there was no elaboration, no attempt to explain further, just a boundary drawn with quiet clarity. The room continued around them, the soft murmur of conversations returning, the gentle movement of servers weaving between tables. But at this one, the atmosphere remained focused, contained within the exchange that had reshaped itself without force. Daniel's expression softened, not visibly to most, but enough, the edges of his usual certainty replaced by something more thoughtful, more deliberate. Then what do you need? He asked, And the question was no longer about finance, no longer about strategy. It was personal now, direct in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. Emily looked at him for a moment, longer than before, as if considering not the answer, but whether the question itself mattered. And when she spoke, her voice was as calm as it had been from the beginning, unchanged by the shift in tone. Time, she said, and the freedom to use it well. And the answer, simple as it was, carried a weight that no number could match, because it was not negotiable, not something that could be transferred or offered across a table. Daniel sat back slowly, the movement unhurried, his eyes still on her, and for the first time that evening, he did not immediately follow with another question, did not redirect, did not regain control through conversation. He simply let the silence remain, not empty, but full of something he had not expected to find in a place like this, in a moment like this, from someone he had initially dismissed. And as the seconds passed, it became clear that whatever this had started as, it had ended somewhere entirely different, somewhere he could not define with a simple answer. And for once, he did not try to. Daniel did not interrupt her answer. And that was new, not just for the men at the table, but for himself, because silence had never been his default response. It had always been a tool, something used strategically, but now it lingered without purpose, without calculation, as if he was allowing it to exist on its own terms. His eyes shifted briefly to the card still resting between them, untouched, its presence now almost symbolic rather than practical, and then back to Emily, who had already moved slightly, not away, but into the rhythm of her work again, adjusting a glass, noting an order from another table, the conversation not clinging to her the way it did to him. Time, he repeated quietly, almost to himself, as if testing the word in a context he rarely considered, because for him, time had always been measured, allocated, optimized, never simply held. One of the men finally spoke, his voice cautious as if stepping into unfamiliar territory. That is not something you can invest in, he said, attempting to bring the conversation back to something concrete, something structured. But even as he spoke, it was clear the direction had already shifted beyond that. Emily glanced at him briefly, her expression unchanged. That depends on how you define return, she replied. And the simplicity of her tone made the statement feel less like an argument and more like a correction, quiet but precise. Daniel leaned forward again, not with urgency, but with intention, his attention now fully anchored. And how do you define it? He asked, and there was no challenge in his voice this time. Only curiosity, the kind that comes when someone realizes they might not be asking the right questions. Emily paused, not because she needed to think, but because she chose her moments carefully, her eyes meeting his again, steady as before. Not in numbers, she said, in alignment. And the word settled, differently than anything she had said before, because it was not tied to finance, not directly, but it carried weight in a way that numbers sometimes failed to. Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of something abstract being placed into a space he had always kept concrete, and that alone required adjustment. Alignment with what? He asked, and the question was quieter now, stripped of performance, almost personal. Emily's gaze softened just slightly, not emotionally, but in focus, as if the answer was less about explanation and more about clarity. With what you would still choose if no one was watching, she said, and the table fell silent again, not because of the complexity of the statement, but because of its simplicity, because it removed the layers people often hid behind, leaving something more direct, more difficult to ignore. Daniel did not respond immediately, and this time, the silence felt different, not like a pause in conversation, but like a moment of internal recalibration, something shifting beneath the surface that no one else could fully see. His hand moved again, lightly touching the edge of the card, but he did not pick it up, did not move it closer to her. He simply acknowledged its presence, as if understanding that it no longer carried the same meaning it had when he first placed it there. You speak like someone who has already made that choice, he said finally, his voice steady, but quieter than before, and there was something in it now that had not been there at the beginning, something closer to respect than curiosity. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked past him briefly, toward the movement of the room, the quiet continuity of everything else happening around them. I am still making it, she replied, and there was no finality in her tone, no claim of certainty, just an ongoing process, something active rather than complete. Daniel leaned back slowly, exhaling in a way that was almost imperceptible, and for the first time that evening, he did not try to redirect the conversation, did not try to reclaim control through structure or logic. He simply allowed it to remain where it was, unresolved but clear, because whatever he had expected from this moment, it was no longer about proving a point, it was about understanding one, and that, he realized, could not be rushed. Daniel did not rush to fill the silence that followed, and for a man who had built his entire career on decisive action, that restraint was unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, yet he remained still, his attention no longer divided, no longer scanning for advantage, just present in a way he had not been at the start of the evening. His eyes moved once more to the card on the table, then back to Emily, who had already turned slightly, not to leave the conversation, but to continue her work, her movement smooth, uninterrupted, as if the shift in atmosphere had not altered her pace at all. You are very deliberate, he said finally, his voice quieter than before, not projecting, not commanding, just observing. And there was something different in it now, something that did not seek to control the outcome. Emily adjusted a glass at the edge of the table, aligning it with the others before responding. Her attention divided, but her presence intact. Only when it matters, she said. And the answer carried no weight of defense, no need to justify, just a simple acknowledgement of choice. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table now, his posture no longer signaling authority but engagement. And this matters? He asked, and the question was not about the conversation itself, but about the moment, about the space they were occupying together. Emily paused briefly, her gaze returning to him, steady, unchanged. It does if you decide it does, she replied, and the statement shifted. The responsibility back to him, quietly, without emphasis. One of the men at the table glanced at Daniel, then at the card, then back again, as if trying to understand how something so simple had become something so significant, but he remained silent, recognizing that this was no longer a conversation he could contribute to. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand moving once more toward the card, and this time he picked it up, turning it slightly between his fingers, not offering it again, but reconsidering it, as if its meaning had changed since the moment he first placed it there. You know, he said, his tone reflective now, almost distant. I have spent years offering opportunities to people who would do anything to take them. And he paused, the words settling as he looked at the card again. And yet you are the first person tonight who has not reached for one. And there was no frustration in his voice, only curiosity, layered with something quieter, something closer to recognition. Emily watched him for a moment, then shifted her attention briefly to a nearby table, acknowledging a request with a small nod before returning her focus, her ability to move between worlds unchanged. Opportunities are only valuable if they match the direction you are already going, she said, and the words landed with a calm certainty that did not seek agreement, only clarity. Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if the statement aligned with something he had known but never articulated, and for a moment he said nothing, allowing the idea to settle without interruption. The room around them continued its quiet rhythm, conversations rising and falling, glasses being refilled, the soft background of a world that had not changed, and yet at this table, something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Daniel placed the card back down, but not in the same position as before, not as an offer waiting to be accepted, but as something else entirely, something reconsidered, something no longer central to the moment. Then perhaps I asked the wrong question, he said finally, his voice steady, but softer than it had been at the beginning of the evening, and this time, the admission carried no hesitation, no resistance, just clarity. Emily met his gaze, her expression unchanged, her posture still. Most people do, she replied gently, and there was no judgment in her tone, only a quiet acknowledgement of something universal. Daniel allowed a faint smile to form, not broad, not performative, just enough to signal understanding, and for the first time that evening, it did not feel like he was trying to win the conversation, because he had already realized that this was not something to win. It was something to learn, and that realization settled over him with a quiet weight, one he did not resist. Daniel did not speak again for several seconds, and no one at the table tried to fill the space, because it no longer felt empty. It felt complete, like a sentence that had reached its natural end without needing to be extended. He looked at Emily, not as a curiosity anymore, not as a variable to be analyzed, but as something far simpler and far more difficult to define, someone who had not tried to impress him, not once, and yet had changed the direction of the entire evening without effort. His hand rested lightly on the table near the card, but he did not touch it again, not because it had lost value, but because he understood now that its value depended on context, and this context had shifted beyond what the card could represent. "You never tried to prove anything," he said quietly, his voice steady, but softer than it had ever been during the conversation, and there was no accusation in it. Only observation, almost admiration. Emily met his gaze briefly, then reached for the check presenter she had prepared earlier, placing it gently at the edge of the table. With the same calm precision she had shown all night, her movements consistent, unaffected by the weight of what had just unfolded. "There was nothing to prove," she replied, her tone even, as if the answer had always been that simple. Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something that could not be negotiated or reframed, and for a moment, he allowed himself to sit with that understanding without trying to turn it into strategy, without trying to extract advantage from it. And that, more than anything, was new. One of the men reached for his wallet, almost instinctively, but paused, glancing at Daniel first, unsure of the unspoken shift in dynamic, and Daniel gave a small nod, not commanding, not directing, just acknowledging the return to something ordinary. The sound of the check being opened, the quiet placement of a credit card, the soft movement of chairs, all of it resumed as if nothing unusual had happened. And yet every person at the table carried something different with them now, something subtle but lasting. Emily took the card, her fingers steady, her attention already moving forward to the next task, the next table, the next moment, without hesitation, without attachment to what had just been said, because for her, it was not an event, it was simply a conversation that had occurred. Daniel watched her for a second longer as she stepped away, her figure blending back into the rhythm of the restaurant. No longer the center of attention, no longer isolated from the environment, just part of it again, and that, somehow, made the moment feel even more significant. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his gaze drifting briefly across the room before returning to the empty space she had left behind, and for the first time that evening, he did not feel the need to control what came next. The card remained on the table, slightly shifted from its original position, untouched, and he left it there, not as a forgotten object, but as a quiet acknowledgement that some things were not meant to be taken immediately, not meant to be decided in a single moment. As the group began to stand, gathering their